There's no pain deeper than burying your own child. William Harrow lived through that hell 4 days ago when a car crash took his wife Sarah and their newborn daughter Emma. Now he stands at their funeral facing a room full of mourners, trying to find words for a grief too deep to speak. Halfway through his eulogy, a homeless man appears at the back of the church. Barefoot and covered in dirt, he walks down the aisle and whispers 5 words that change everything. "Your baby didn't die, sir." Thomas had been there that night. He pulled the screaming infant from the wreckage before the car exploded. But who would believe a homeless drifter? He vanished with the child, haunted by his failure to save the mother. Now guilt has brought him back. But where is Emma, and can William find her before it's too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, William Harrow stood in the penthouse office of Harrow Industries, 37 floors above Manhattan, watching the city pulse with evening life. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing, a boy from the wrong side of Detroit who'd clawed his way to billionaire status through sheer determination and an almost ruthless focus on success. The corner office held the spoils of that journey: awards, photographs with presidents, and a view that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But none of it mattered when Sarah walked through those mahogany doors. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth without needing to prove it. Dr. Sarah Chen, 34, chief of pediatric surgery at Mount Sinai, brilliant, beautiful, and utterly unimpressed by his wealth. Their first meeting had been at a charity gala where she'd politely declined his invitation to dinner. "I don't date my patients' parents," she'd said with a gentle smile that somehow made the rejection feel like a gift. "I don't have children," William had replied, confused. "Then we have nothing to talk about." It took him 3 months to change her mind, not with flowers or expensive dinners, but by volunteering at the children's hospital where she worked. Every Tuesday evening, he'd read stories to young patients, his deep voice softening as he brought fairy tales to life for kids fighting battles that would humble any adult. Sarah noticed. She always noticed the small kindnesses people thought no one saw. Their courtship unfolded like a slow bloom. Coffee conversations that stretched past midnight, walks through Central Park where she'd point out birds he'd never bothered to see, quiet dinners where she taught him that love wasn't about conquest but surrender. She showed him rooms in his own heart he'd never known existed. When he proposed on the hospital's rooftop garden, surrounded by flowers she'd planted for the pediatric ward, her yes came with tears he'd never seen her shed. "You're going to be a wonderful father," she whispered against his neck as the city sparkled below them. The wedding was small. 50 guests in Sarah's childhood church, her Chinese-American family mixing beautifully with his smaller circle. His brother David, 5 years younger but somehow older in his cynicism, served as best man with barely concealed skepticism about the match. "She's too good for you, Will," David had said during the bachelor party. "What happens when she figures that out?" But Sarah never made William feel less than worthy. She made him want to be worthy. Their first year of marriage transformed him in ways his therapist had spent decades trying to achieve. Sarah's influence was gentle but profound. She didn't demand he change, but inspired him to want to. He learned to listen without trying to solve, to be present without multitasking, to find joy in simple moments he'd previously rushed past. When Sarah became pregnant, William's world shifted on its axis. He'd never wanted children. His own childhood had been too harsh, too unpredictable. But watching Sarah's face when the doctor confirmed what they'd hoped for, seeing her hand move instinctively to her still flat stomach, something fundamental rewired in his chest. "Are you scared?" she asked that night as they lay in their bedroom, her head on his shoulder. "Terrified," he admitted. "What if I'm like my father?" Sarah lifted herself up to look at him, her dark eyes serious. Your father abandoned his family because he was selfish and weak. You're neither of those things. You're going to love this baby so much it scares you. And that's exactly what makes you different. She was right about the fear, wrong about everything else. The pregnancy was textbook perfect. Sarah glowed with that mysterious radiance people always mentioned, but William had assumed was myth. She worked until her 8th month, only stopping when her colleagues practically staged an intervention. William found himself talking to her belly, reading quarterly reports aloud, because Sarah insisted the baby should get used to Daddy's voice. "She's going to be brilliant," Sarah would say, hands curved over her expanding middle. "I can feel it. She kicks every time you talk about the business. Our little CEO." Emma Rose Harrow arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, after 12 hours of labor, that taught William new meanings of the word helpless. He'd faced down corporate raiders, hostile takeovers, and congressional hearings, but watching Sarah breathe through contractions left him feeling utterly useless. The moment Emma emerged, red-faced and screaming, impossibly small and perfect, William understood why people use the word miracle without embarrassment. When the nurse placed her in his arms, this tiny person who shared his DNA but was utterly her own being, he felt a love so overwhelming it physically hurt. "She's beautiful," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks without permission. "She has your stubborn chin," Sarah laughed, exhausted but radiant. Poor thing. Those 4 days were the happiest of William's life. Emma was healthy, nursing well, and already showing signs of what Sarah called personality, a tendency to open her eyes wide when William spoke, as if she recognized the voice that had read her so many bedtime stories before birth. Margaret Walsh, his assistant for 15 years, brought balloons and stayed to coo over the baby with genuine affection. She'd been the closest thing to family William had, besides David, and seeing her hold, Emma felt like blessing. "She's going to wrap you around her little finger," Margaret predicted, adjusting Emma's tiny hat. "Already has," William admitted without shame. David visited on the last day, bringing an expensive stuffed animal and the same skeptical expression he'd worn at the wedding. He held Emma awkwardly, like she might break in his hands. "She's small," was his only comment. "All babies are small, David," Sarah said gently. "Would you like to hold her again?" "I'm not really a baby person," he handed Emma back quickly. "But congratulations. She seems healthy." That was David, always hedging his emotional bets, always preparing for disappointment. William understood it. Their childhood had taught them both to expect the worst. But Sarah had shown William another way to live. They were supposed to go home the next morning. William had already installed the car seat, following the YouTube tutorial 3 times to make sure it was perfect. Sarah had packed Emma's going-home outfit, a soft yellow dress with tiny ducklings that made her look like something from a fairy tale. The night before, William lay awake listening to Emma's soft breathing from the bassinet beside their hospital bed. Sarah slept deeply, finally getting the rest her body needed after labor. The room was quiet except for the whisper of the ventilation system and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. William thought about his father, who'd walked out when William was 12. He thought about his mother, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat and died too young from the stress. He thought about all the ways his childhood had broken him, and all the ways Sarah had helped him heal. Emma stirred, making the soft sounds newborns make when they dream. William reached over to touch her tiny fist, marveling at her perfect fingernails, her impossibly soft skin. "I promise," he whispered in the darkness. "I promise I'll be better than he was. I promise I'll be here. I promise I'll love you. And you're mother enough for 10 fathers." It was the last promise he'd ever make to his daughter. The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of March weather that couldn't decide between winter and spring. Sarah woke early, excited to take Emma home to the nursery they'd spent months preparing. William had wanted to hire a decorator, but Sarah insisted on doing it themselves. painting the walls a soft green, assembling the crib with the instruction manual spread across their living room floor, choosing every detail with the careful attention of people who knew they were creating something sacred. Margaret had arranged for a car service, knowing William would be too nervous to drive with Emma for the first time. The driver was experienced with newborns, Margaret assured them, though William still checked the car seat installation twice before allowing anyone near his daughter. Sarah sat in the back with Emma, who slept peacefully in her yellow dress. Tiny hands curled against her chest. William couldn't stop turning around to look at them, his wife glowing with new motherhood, his daughter perfect and peaceful in her arms. "She's really ours," Sarah said softly, stroking Emma's downy hair. After all those years of thinking it might never happen, William reached back to touch Sarah's hand. "Best thing I ever did was volunteer at that hospital. Second best," she corrected with a smile. "The best thing you ever did was become her father." They were 3 blocks from home when the drunk driver ran the red light. The screech of brakes and shattering glass lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched into eternity. William felt the world spin, heard Sarah's scream cut short, felt Emma's car seat jolt against the impact. Then darkness. He woke to sirens and shouting, his head pounding, vision blurred. The car had rolled twice before slamming into a streetlight. Sarah hung unconscious from her seatbelt, blood trickling from her temple. Behind her, Emma's car seat had torn loose from its base. "Sarah!" His voice came out as a croak. "Emma!" A paramedic appeared at the shattered window, young face grim with professional calm. "Sir, we're going to get you out. Try not to move. My wife, my baby, we're working on them. Stay still." The next hours blurred together in a nightmare of emergency rooms, surgical waiting areas, and conversations that didn't make sense. William sat in a hard plastic chair, his head bandaged, watching doctors and nurses move with practiced urgency. That somehow made everything worse. Margaret arrived first, her usually composed face streaked with tears. She didn't speak, just sat beside him and held his hand while they waited for news. David came next, his expression unreadable. He brought coffee William couldn't taste and newspapers he couldn't focus on reading. Dr. Martinez appeared at 3 a.m., still in surgical scrubs, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. William knew before he spoke what the words would be. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrow. We did everything we could. Sarah had died from internal injuries sustained in the impact. Emma, tiny, perfect Emma, had suffered severe trauma when her car seat failed. Both were gone before the ambulances reached the hospital. The drunk driver walked away with minor scratches and a suspended license. William spent the next 3 days in a haze of funeral arrangements and condolence calls. Margaret handled most of it, her efficiency a blessing he couldn't properly acknowledge. David made the necessary phone calls, spoke to lawyers about wrongful death suits, dealt with the media attention that William's wealth inevitably attracted. The funeral home was everything Sarah would have hated, too formal, too cold, too focused, on appearances rather than love. But William couldn't make those decisions. He could barely remember to breathe. The closed caskets sat side by side at the front of the church, Sarah's adult-sized, Emma's heartbreakingly small. White roses covered both, the same flowers from their wedding bouquet. The irony felt like another knife twist. People filled the pews. Colleagues from the hospital where Sarah worked, business associates of William's, family members who'd driven from across the country. David sat in the front row beside him, a steady presence even in his own grief. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with tissues, mourning the family she'd watched form and now watched destroyed. William clutched Sarah's wedding ring in his palm, the simple platinum band she'd chosen because it wouldn't interfere with her surgical gloves. The hospital had given it back to him, along with her other personal effects. Her stethoscope, the small stuffed elephant she kept in her coat pocket for, nervous young patients, the photo of Emma from her first day home. When it came time for William to speak, he walked to the podium on unsteady legs. The eulogy he'd prepared seemed inadequate. Words about Sarah's compassion, her skill as a surgeon, her dreams for Emma. How could sentences capture a love that had redefined his understanding of what it meant to be alive? Sarah saw the best in everyone, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She had this way of looking at you that made you want to be worthy of that faith. When she told me I'd be a good father, I believed her because Sarah didn't lie. She didn't flatter. She just saw what was true, even when we couldn't see it ourselves. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces blurred by his tears. Emma was only 4 days old, but in those 4 days, she changed everything I thought I knew about love. She was perfect. They both were perfect. And now, his voice broke. The prepared words fled his mind. He stood there holding Sarah's ring, surrounded by flowers and sympathy and the suffocating weight of a future that would never come to pass. That's when the homeless man appeared. He stood at the back of the church, impossible to miss among the well-dressed mourners. Barefoot, wearing clothes that hadn't seen a washing machine in weeks, his dark hair matted and his face gaunt with hunger. Security moved to intercept him, but he walked forward with purpose, ignoring their attempts to stop him. The congregation murmured as he approached the front of the church. William watched, too stunned to react, as the man climbed the steps to the altar. "Your baby didn't die, sir." The words cut through the church silence like a blade. William stared at him, certain he'd misheard. "What did you say?" "Your baby," the man repeated, his voice carrying a slight accent, Chinese-American like Sarah's. "She didn't die. I pulled her from the wreck." The church erupted. Security moved forward. David started to stand. Margaret gasped audibly. But William held up his hand, stopping all movement. "What's your name?" "Thomas." "Thomas Chen." Sarah's maiden name. The coincidence felt like a message from somewhere beyond the veil of grief that had wrapped around William's world. "You're saying Emma is alive?" Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I was there that night, sleeping under the overpass. I heard the crash, saw the car roll. I got to it before the police, before the fire department. Your wife," his voice caught. "I couldn't save her. She was already gone. But the baby, she was crying, screaming. The car seat was damaged, but she was alive. I got her out just before." The car caught fire. The church had gone completely silent. William felt the world tilt again, the same sensation as during the crash, but somehow more disorienting. Where is she? Safe. She's safe and healthy and... Thomas looked around at the crowd, at the security guards tense to grab him, at David's skeptical expression. "I know how this sounds. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I have proof." He reached into his tattered jacket and pulled out a small plastic bracelet, the kind hospitals put on newborns for identification. William recognized it immediately. Emma Rose Harrow, born March 15th, 3:42 a.m. "This is impossible," David said, standing now. "The hospital confirmed." "The hospital made a mistake," Thomas interrupted. "They assumed because I couldn't save your wife. I couldn't save the baby either. In all the chaos, the smoke, the darkness, they never found her because I'd already gotten her out." William took the bracelet with shaking hands. It was real, worn but unmistakable. The tiny plastic band that had been around Emma's wrist in those first precious hours. "Why didn't you bring her to the hospital? Why didn't you tell anyone?" Thomas's face crumpled with shame. "Because I'm nobody. A homeless man with no ID, no permanent address, no credibility. Who would believe me? And I..." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I couldn't save your wife. I tried, but I was too late. I thought they'd blame me, arrest me. So I ran. You ran with my daughter. I saved your daughter." The words carried a quiet dignity that cut through Thomas's obvious distress. "She was hurt, crying, scared. I knew how to help her. I used to be a doctor before I lost everything. I took care of her, made sure she was safe, found her a family who could give her what she needed." The implications hit William like another collision. Emma was alive. Emma had been alive all this time, while he'd grieved over an empty coffin, while he'd made arrangements to bury a child who wasn't dead. But she was with strangers now, a 4-day-old infant, torn from her parents and placed with people who thought She was an orphan in need of rescue. Where is she now? William's voice came out steady, though everything inside him was screaming. Thomas stepped back, suddenly wary. First, you need to prove you deserve her. Being her biological father doesn't mean you're worthy to raise her. I've watched you these past few months, Mr. Harrow. I've seen how you handle loss, how you treat people when you're in pain. Emma needs more than money. She needs someone who understands what love really means. You've been watching me. I had to know what kind of man you were, whether you changed, whether losing them made you better or worse. Thomas looked around the church again, at the expensive flowers, the designer suits, the obvious display of wealth. Money can't raise a child, Mr. Harrow. I know you loved your wife, but love isn't enough either. Emma needs someone who'll put her first always. Someone who won't let his own pain become her burden. William felt fury rising alongside hope. How dare this stranger judge him, test him, keep his daughter from him? But beneath the anger was something else, the recognition that Thomas was right. The man who'd built an empire through ruthless focus might not be the man Emma needed. What do you want from me? I want you to prove you've learned what your wife was trying to teach you, that being a father isn't about providing or protecting or controlling. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Thomas turned to go, then looked back. She's beautiful, Mr. Harrow. She has your eyes and her mother's smile. And she's loved. Wherever she is, she's with people who see her as a gift, not a burden or a replacement for what was lost. If you want her back, you'll have to prove you can see her that way too. Then he was gone, slipping through the crowd before security could stop him, leaving William standing at the altar holding Emma's hospital bracelet and the impossible truth that his daughter was alive somewhere in a world that had suddenly become both infinitely larger and impossibly small. The funeral ended in chaos. Half the congregation assumed Thomas was a disturbed individual exploiting a grieving father's vulnerability. The other half whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. David, immediately, went into damage control mode, speaking in hushed tones with their family lawyer, while Margaret tried to manage the crowd of reporters who'd somehow materialized outside the church. William sat in the front pew long after most people had left, staring at Emma's hospital bracelet. The plastic felt warm against his palm, worn smooth in places as if it had been handled frequently. He couldn't reconcile the impossible hope blooming in his chest with the grief that had defined his existence for the past 4 days. Will, David's voice cut through his reverie. We need to talk. They drove home in silence, David occasionally glancing at William with the expression he'd worn as children, when William had done something particularly reckless. The penthouse felt different now, not empty the way it had since the accident, but charged with possibility that felt almost dangerous. Margaret was already there, having used her key to let herself in. She'd cleared away the sympathy flowers and casserole dishes, restoring some sense of normalcy to the space. But nothing could mask the nursery down the hall, still perfect and waiting. The mobile Sarah had chosen still hanging motionless above. The unused crib. You can't seriously be considering this, David said the moment they were alone. Some homeless man shows up at Sarah's funeral with a wild story and you're ready to believe him? He had her bracelet, which proves nothing. Those bracelets fall off all the time. He could have found it at the scene, kept it as some kind of sick trophy. William looked at his brother, successful in his own right as a corporate attorney, but always skeptical, always prepared for disappointment. David had learned early to protect himself by expecting the worst, and 47 years of life had done nothing to change that instinct. What if he's telling the truth? What if he's not? What if this is some elaborate con? You're worth billions, Will. People have tried stranger schemes to get at your money. Margaret appeared in the doorway with coffee. Neither of them would drink. I've been thinking about what he said, she offered quietly. About being a doctor. There was something in his voice, the way he spoke about medical procedures. It didn't sound like someone making things up. David shot her a sharp look. You're not helping. I'm not trying to help, or hurt. I'm trying to make sense of what we all just witnessed. Margaret set down the coffee service with her usual precision. William, what does your heart tell you? It was a question Sarah would have asked. Sarah, who believed in intuition and small miracles and the possibility that love could overcome impossible odds. William closed his eyes and tried to feel past the grief and confusion to whatever truth lay beneath. My heart tells me she's alive. Your heart isn't reliable right now, David said gently. You've been through trauma, loss, medication for the pain from the accident. You're not thinking clearly. Then help me think clearly. William opened his eyes, looking at his brother with desperate honesty. Help me figure out how to handle this. David sighed, running a hand through hair that was graying at the temples. Okay, if, and this is a huge if, this Thomas person is telling the truth, then we need to approach this carefully. We hire investigators, check hospital records, verify his story before you get your hopes up any higher. I've already called Henderson, Margaret said, referring to the private investigation firm William had used for corporate security issues. They can have someone on this by tomorrow morning. That evening, William found himself in Emma's nursery for the first time since bringing her home from the hospital. Everything was exactly as Sarah had arranged it. Books on the shelves, clothes. In the tiny dresser, the rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. The room smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Sarah had sewn herself, small touches that made the space feel like a sanctuary. He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled to the voice memo Sarah had recorded during her 7th month of pregnancy. She'd been lying in bed, hands curved over her belly, humming a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child. William had captured it without her knowing, thinking he'd surprise her with it later. Now he played it on repeat, Sarah's voice filling the empty nursery with love and hope and promises that seemed both precious and heartbreaking. If Emma was alive, she'd never heard her mother's lullaby. If Emma was alive, strangers were tucking her into bed, reading her stories, making the 1,000 tiny decisions that shaped a child's world. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Henderson's people found something, she said without preamble. Can you come to the office? The Harrow Industries building was empty except for security and the cleaning crew. William's footsteps echoed. In the marble lobby as he made his way to the elevator, muscle memory carrying him to the 37th floor while his mind raced through possibilities. Henderson's team had set up in the conference room. Laptops, files, photographs spread across the polished table like pieces of a puzzle they were trying to solve. Janet Henderson herself was there, a former FBI agent whose reputation for thoroughness had made her William's first choice for sensitive investigations. What did you find? Several interesting things. Janet gestured to a chair, her expression carefully neutral. First, Thomas Chen does exist, and his story checks out partially. He was a medical resident at Mount Sinai until 18 months ago. Promising student, excellent reviews, specialty in pediatric emergency medicine. She slid a photograph across the table, a hospital ID card showing a younger, cleaner version of the man who'd appeared at the funeral. The same dark eyes, the same bone structure, but filled out and hopeful instead of gaunt with loss. What happened to him? Malpractice suit. A child died under his care. Complicated case, probably unavoidable, but the family needed someone to blame. The suit was eventually dismissed, but the hospital let him go during the investigation. He lost his apartment, his savings, his medical license, fell through the cracks of a system that's supposed to protect people like him. William stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the successful young doctor with the desperate man who'd claimed to have saved Emma. You said his story checks out partially. The part about being at the scene is believable. We found security footage from a traffic camera that shows someone matching his description in the area around the time of your accident. But as for the rest, Janet pulled out another file. We accessed the emergency response records. EMTs found evidence of a child's car seat in the vehicle, but no child. They assumed the infant had been ejected and the body lost in the subsequent fire. No, one thought to look for signs that someone had been rescued. Because homeless people don't usually perform emergency rescues? Because in a crisis, people make assumptions. The EMTs saw a dead mother, a destroyed car seat, and concluded the worst. It happens more often than you'd think. Margaret leaned forward. What about hospital records? If Emma survived and Thomas treated her, there would be some documentation. That's where it gets complicated. Janet opened her laptop, showing them a series of medical databases. There's no record of any infant matching Emma's description being admitted to any hospital in the area that night, which either means she died at the scene as originally believed or Thomas treated her himself. William finished. Off the books, away from hospitals that might ask questions he couldn't answer. It's possible he'd have the knowledge, and given his situation, the motivation to avoid official channels. Janet closed the laptop and looked at William with the directness he'd come to expect from her. But Mr. Harrow, you need to understand, even if Emma survived that night, even if Thomas saved her, the chances of her being alive now, 4 months later, cared for by strangers with no medical supervision, she's alive. The certainty in William's voice surprised even him. I don't know how I know, but I know. Janet and Margaret exchanged glances. David, who'd been quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke. Knowing and proving are different things. We need more than intuition and a hospital bracelet. Then we find more. William stood, pacing to the windows that looked out over a city full of hiding places and lost people. We find Thomas. We make him tell us where she is. He's homeless. Will, people like that don't want to be found. Everyone wants something. We just have to figure out what Thomas wants and give it to him. Margaret made a note. I can start by checking the shelters, soup kitchens, places where he might go for food or medical care, and I'll have my team canvass the area where he was. Seen, Janet added. Homeless populations have their own networks. Someone will know where to find him. As they prepared to leave, William felt something shift inside him. The first stirring of purpose he'd experienced since the accident. For 4 days, he'd been drowning in grief, letting others handle the decisions that needed to be made. Now, faced with the possibility that Emma was alive, he felt a familiar surge of the determination that had built his empire. But this was different. This wasn't about conquest or competition. This was about love. The kind Sarah had tried to teach him, the kind that put someone else's well-being before your own pride or comfort. If Emma was alive, he would find her. If Emma was alive, he would prove himself worthy of being her father. If Emma was alive, he would make sure she came home where she belonged. The question that kept him awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah, was whether home was still the right place for a little girl who'd spent 4 months believing someone else was her family. The first real lead came from an unexpected source. Margaret had spent 3 days visiting every shelter and soup kitchen in Manhattan, showing Thomas's photo and asking careful questions. Most people looked at her expensive clothes and professional demeanor with suspicion, offering nothing more than shrugs and claims of ignorance. But at St. Vincent's Community Kitchen on the Lower East Side, an elderly woman named Rosa recognized Thomas immediately. Dr. Chen, she said, her accent thick with decades of Spanish and reverence. He saved my grandson when the hospitals wouldn't see us. No insurance, you understand. But the doctor, he didn't care about papers or money, just helped the boy. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. When was this? 2 months ago. Little Miguel had the fever, couldn't breathe. Dr. Chen knew what to do, gave us medicine, stayed with us all night to make sure Miguel was okay. Rosa crossed herself. An angel, that man. God works through him. Do you know where we can find him? Rosa's expression grew wary. Why are you looking for him? He in trouble? Margaret chose her words carefully. Someone needs his help. Someone he helped before. After a long moment, Rosa nodded toward the kitchen's back door. Sometimes he comes for dinner. Not regular, but sometimes. Tonight is possible. William arrived at the soup kitchen that evening wearing jeans and a worn sweater. The most casual. Clothes Margaret had seen him wear in 15 years. He'd left his driver at home, taking the subway like any other New Yorker, seeking anonymity in the city's vast indifference. The kitchen served anyone who needed a meal. No questions asked. William joined the line of people waiting for food. Construction workers still dusty from job sites, elderly folks on fixed incomes stretching their social security, families whose circumstances had temporarily outstripped their pride. He accepted. A tray of meatloaf and mashed potatoes from a volunteer who smiled without recognition, found a seat at one of the long tables beside a man who introduced himself only as Jimmy and spoke passionately about the Mets' chances this season. Thomas didn't appear that night or the next, but William kept returning, partly from hope and partly from an education he hadn't expected to need. The soup kitchen drew people whose stories challenged every assumption he'd made about poverty and homelessness. There was Maria, a single mother, who worked 2 jobs, but still couldn't afford both rent and groceries in the same month. Bobby, a veteran with PTSD, who'd lost his apartment when flashbacks made it impossible to hold steady employment. Linda, a former teacher whose medical bills from cancer treatment had consumed her savings and her home. First time? Linda asked. On William's 3rd visit, noticing how he still held his plastic spoon, like it might break. That obvious? She smiled with the warmth Sarah had always shown her patients' parents. Honey, you got the look of someone who's never been hungry a day in his life. Not judging, just observing. What gave it away? You're the only person here who says thank you to the servers every time they refill your coffee. Linda sipped her own cup, studying William with intelligent eyes. Most folks who need this place have learned that gratitude is a luxury. You hold on to it when you got it, but you don't waste it on people who are supposed to help you anyway. William found himself returning not just to look for Thomas, but to talk with Linda, who'd been an English teacher for 30 years before her diagnosis. She asked what he did for work, and he gave the vague answer he'd prepared. Something about business consulting. Must be doing well to have such soft hands, she observed. But you got sad eyes. Something you lost recently. The question opened a door he hadn't expected. Over the next hour, William found himself telling Linda about Sarah and Emma, not the whole truth about his wealth or Thomas's claims, but the core of it. A man who'd lost his family in an accident, trying to figure out how to keep living. Grief changes you, Linda said when he finished. Makes you see things different. I used to think poor people were poor because they made bad choices. Then I got sick, learned how fast everything you think is solid can just disappear. Now I see we're all just people trying to get through our days with whatever strength we got left. Do you think people can really change? Become someone completely different from who they used to be? Linda considered this, watching the volunteers clear tables and prepare to close for the evening. I think people become who they were always meant to be, once life strips away all the things that were hiding their true selves. Question is, you gonna like what you find underneath? That night, William walked home through streets he'd driven past thousands of times, but never really seen. The city looked different at sidewalk level, more immediate, more human. He noticed the subway grates where homeless people gathered for warmth, the all-night diners where shift workers grabbed meals between jobs, the emergency rooms where people waited hours for care they couldn't afford anywhere else. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Found him. William's heart hammered as he read her follow-up message. Riverside Park, near the 79th Street entrance. Come alone. The park was quieter at night, the usual joggers and dog walkers replaced by people seeking privacy or solitude. William found Margaret sitting on a bench near the designated spot, her professional composure intact, despite the late hour. He's been watching you, she said without preamble. The soup kitchen visits, your conversations with Linda. He knows you've been looking. For him. Where is he? Margaret nodded toward a cluster of trees about 50 yards away. He'll only talk to you. No investigators, no lawyers, no recording devices, just you. William approached the trees slowly, uncertain what he hoped to accomplish. Thomas emerged from the shadows like a ghost, still gaunt but somehow more solid than he'd appeared at the funeral. His clothes were cleaner, his hair recently washed. Someone had been taking care of him, or he'd been taking care of himself. "You've been learning," Thomas said, his voice carrying approval William hadn't expected. "Learning what? That the world is bigger than your penthouse? That people's stories are more complicated than their bank statements?" Thomas stepped closer, studying William's face in the pale light from a nearby street lamp. "Linda likes you. Does you listen without trying to fix everything? You know Linda? I know everyone at St. Vincent's. It's my community now." Thomas sat on a fallen log, gesturing for William to join him. "Rosa told me Margaret was looking for me, said you needed my help. I need to know where Emma is." "Why?" "So you can swoop in with your lawyers and your money and take her from the only family she's ever known." The accusation stung because William recognized the truth in it. "She's my daughter. Biology doesn't make you a father. Sarah knew that. She chose you not because you could give her things, but because she saw who you could become." Thomas picked up a small stone, turning it over in his weathered hands. "The question is, have you become that man yet? What do you want me to prove? I've been coming to the soup kitchen, talking to people, trying to understand." "That's a start. But understanding poverty for a few weeks doesn't make you ready to raise a child who's been shaped by it." Thomas looked at William with eyes that had seen too much loss. "Emma's with a family that has nothing but love. No trust funds, no private schools, no safety net except each other. Are you ready for that kind of love? The kind that doesn't come with guarantees or contracts?" William thought about Sarah, about the way she'd loved him without trying to change him, but in a way that made him want to change himself. "I'm ready to try. Trying isn't enough. Emma deserves better than good intentions." The words hung between them like a challenge. William felt the familiar surge of frustration that came when someone told him he couldn't have something he wanted. But underneath the frustration was something else, recognition that Thomas was protecting Emma the same way Sarah would have. "Tell me what I need to do." Thomas smiled for the first time since William had known him, a sad, complicated expression that held both hope and doubt. "You need to understand what you're really asking. For Emma isn't the baby you lost 4 months ago. She's been growing, changing, bonding with people who think she's their daughter. If you take her from them, you're not saving her, you're traumatizing her. Then what's the alternative? That depends on what kind of man you've become." Thomas stood, preparing to disappear back into the shadows. "I'll give you an address. Tomorrow. The family that's been caring for Emma, but you have to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll think about what's best for her, not what's best for you. Promise me that if you meet her and realize she's better off where she is, you'll walk away." William felt his chest tighten. The idea of finding Emma only to lose her again seemed impossible to bear. But looking at Thomas, this man who'd sacrificed everything to save a stranger's child, he understood that love sometimes meant making the hardest choice of all. "I promise." Thomas nodded once, then melted back into the darkness, leaving William alone with the weight of a commitment that felt both sacred and terrifying. The address Thomas provided led to Astoria, Queens, a neighborhood of small apartment buildings and corner bodegas that felt worlds away from Manhattan's gleaming towers. William sat in his car across the street from 4315 Northern Boulevard for 20 minutes, watching ordinary people live ordinary lives. Children played on the sidewalk while their parents chatted in Spanish, Polish, and languages he couldn't identify. An elderly man watered plants on his fire escape. Teenagers skateboarded past with earbuds, blocking out everything but their own soundtracks. The building Thomas had directed him to was unremarkable. 6 stories of red brick, probably, built in the 1960s, with air conditioning units jutting from windows like mechanical barnacles. William checked the address again, apartment 4B, the Kowalski family. He'd spent the morning researching them through the private databases his money could access. Frank Kowalski, 34, worked as a transit mechanic for the MTA. His wife, Anna, 31, was a nurse's aide at a nursing home in Flushing, combined income just over $60,000 a year. No criminal records, no outstanding debts beyond a modest car loan and student loans that would follow them into middle age. Normal people living a normal life. According to the records, they'd been married 8 years and had been trying to have children for 5 of those years. Multiple rounds of fertility treatments had drained their savings without success. The final round had failed just 2 weeks before Thomas appeared at their door with a baby he claimed needed temporary care. William imagined that night, Frank and Anna, probably still raw from their latest disappointment, opening their door to find a homeless man holding an infant. Most people would have called the police immediately, but something about Thomas must have convinced them to listen, to take in a child who needed shelter while he figured out a more permanent solution. Except the temporary arrangement had become permanent when Thomas disappeared. Overwhelmed by guilt and uncertainty about what he'd set in motion, now Emma had been with the Kowalskis for 4 months, longer than she'd lived with William and Sarah. In developmental terms, she'd spent most of her conscious life with people she'd learned to recognize as parents. William's phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. "Where are you?" His brother's voice carried the edge of controlled concern. "Margaret said you were meeting with potential witnesses." "I'm in Queens." "What's in Queens?" William watched a young woman push a stroller past his car, cooing at the baby inside with the unconscious devotion universal to new mothers. "Emma." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that William wondered if the call had dropped. "Will, you can't just show up at these people's house. If Emma is really there, if they've been caring for her illegally, this needs to be handled through proper channels. Lawyers, social services, court orders, and traumatize everyone in the process." "You're talking about kidnapping, Will. These people have been harboring your daughter for 4 months. Whatever their intentions, they've committed a serious crime." William understood his brother's perspective. David had spent his career thinking in terms of legal precedents and liability management, but this situation existed in the spaces between laws, in the gray areas where human need met bureaucratic inadequacy. What if they're good parents? They're not her parents. You are. The distinction felt less clear from where William sat, watching the rhythms of a neighborhood where people took care of each other, not because they had to, but because that's what communities did. He ended the call and walked across the street. The building's lobby was small and clean, with mailboxes showing names in multiple languages and a bulletin board advertising everything from English tutoring to quinceañera planning. William found the buzzer for 4B and pressed it before he could lose his nerve. "Yes?" The voice was female, accented with what sounded like Polish inflection. "Mrs. Kowalski? My name is William Harrow. I'd like to talk to you about the baby." Another. Long silence, then. "I don't know what you're talking about. Her name is Emma. She's been with you for 4 months. I'm her father." The intercom crackled with static, and William thought she might hang up. Instead, the door buzzed open. Anna Kowalski was waiting in the hallway when the elevator opened on the 4th floor. She was small and slight, with prematurely grey hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that held the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. Her nurse's aide uniform suggested she'd either just returned from work or was preparing to leave for a night shift. "You're really her father?" "I am." She studied his face with the intensity of someone trained to read vital signs in emergency situations. Whatever she saw must have convinced her, because she stepped aside to let him into the apartment. The space was tiny, but immaculately kept. A living room that doubled as a dining room, a kitchenette with appliances that were older, but well-maintained, family photos covering every available surface. The furniture showed wear, but had been chosen with care, each piece serving multiple functions in the limited space. And there, in a portable crib positioned where Anna could see it from anywhere in the main room, was Emma. William's knees nearly gave out. She was bigger than he remembered, obviously healthy, wearing a pink onesie that had been washed so many times it was soft as silk. Her dark hair had grown into soft curls, and when she looked up at the sound of voices, he saw Sarah's eyes staring back at him. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She's perfect." Anna's voice carried a mother's pride that made William's chest ache. "Sleeps through the night now, loves her bath time, smiles at everyone. The happiest baby I've ever seen." Emma made a soft sound and reached toward Anna with the automatic trust of a child who knew she was loved. Anna picked her up with practiced ease, and Emma settled against her shoulder with the contentment that came from recognition and routine. "How?" William's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "How did this happen?" Anna sat on the couch, adjusting Emma so she could see William while remaining secure in her arms. "A man came to our door 4 months ago, said he was a doctor, that he'd found a baby who needed help. We thought he was crazy at first, but then we saw her, so small, obviously hungry, with this little hospital bracelet that said her name was Emma. You didn't call the police?" "We talked about it. But the man, Thomas, he said the baby's parents had died, that there was no one to claim her, that social services would put her in the system where she might wait months for placement." Anna's voice grew defensive. "We just failed our last IVF cycle. We'd been waiting for years to adopt, but the lists are so long, the requirements so strict. When he said she needed a family right away, you said yes. Frank thought we should check with authorities first, make sure everything was legal. But I looked at this tiny person who'd already lost so much, and I couldn't bear the thought of her spending even one night in some institutional care facility." Anna's arms tightened, protectively around Emma. "So we said yes, temporarily, just until Thomas could work out a permanent arrangement. But he disappeared. For weeks, we tried to find him, asked around the neighborhood, checked the shelters. Nothing. Finally, we realized we had a choice: turn Emma over to child services and hope for the best, or keep caring for her ourselves. That must have been a difficult decision." Anna looked down at Emma, who was beginning to fuss with the approaching dinner hour. "It was the easiest decision we ever made. Frank wanted to make it official, start adoption proceedings, but I was afraid someone would come looking for her. Afraid they'd take her away if we drew attention to the situation. Someone did come looking. You." Anna's eyes filled with tears she was trying not to shed. "I knew this day would come eventually. I hoped—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I hoped maybe her parents really were dead, that nobody would claim her, that she could just be ours." Emma began to cry. Not the wail of distress, but the rhythmic complaint of a baby who knew dinner was overdue and trusted that someone would respond appropriately. Anna stood and moved toward the kitchenette, where bottles and formula were arranged. With military precision. "Would you like to feed her?" The offer caught William off guard. He'd assumed Anna would see him as a threat, someone trying to steal the child she'd grown to love. Instead, she was inviting him into the most intimate routine of parenthood. "I don't know if I remember how. It's like riding a bicycle, only more rewarding." Anna prepared the bottle with practiced efficiency, testing the temperature on her wrist before handing it to William. "Support her head. Let her set the pace. She'll tell you what she needs." William accepted Emma with shaking hands, terrified. He'd somehow break this perfect little person who was simultaneously familiar and completely changed. She weighed more than he remembered, felt more solid, more present. When he offered the bottle, she latched on eagerly, her eyes never leaving. His face. "She knows you," Anna said softly. "Babies remember more than we think they do." Sitting in that tiny apartment, feeding his daughter while her adoptive mother watched with obvious heartbreak, William understood the full complexity of what Thomas had asked him to consider. Emma wasn't just alive. She was thriving. She was loved completely by people who'd reorganized their entire world around her needs. Taking her home wouldn't be a rescue. It would be another trauma in a young life that had already survived too much chaos. But leaving her here would mean giving up the chance to be the father Sarah had believed he could become. The front door opened, and a stocky man with calloused hands and tired eyes entered the apartment. Frank Kowalski stopped short when he saw William holding Emma. "Anna, what's going on?" "Frank," Anna's voice was steady despite the tears now flowing freely. "This is Emma's father." Frank Kowalski's reaction was everything William had expected and feared. The man went rigid, his eyes moving from William to Emma to his wife, with the calculating assessment of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from life. Her father. The words came out flat, devoid of emotion. The one who's supposed to be dead. "Frank," Anna began. "No, Anna. We knew this might happen. We talked about it." Frank set down his lunch cooler and work jacket with deliberate precision, buying time to process what was happening. "We always said if her real family showed up, we'd have to let her go. I'm not here to take her," William said quickly, though the words felt like lies even as he spoke them. "I just wanted to see her, to understand what happened." Frank's laugh was bitter. "Right, a billionaire shows up at our door and just wants to chat. Anna, he probably has lawyers waiting downstairs." I came alone. This time, Frank moved to the window, looking down at the street as if he could spot surveillance teams from 4 floors up. "But men like you don't stay alone for long when there's something you want." The accusation stung because it contained truth. William's instinct was to use every resource at his disposal, money, influence, legal power, to get what he wanted. The fact that he'd chosen to come here personally, without lawyers or court orders, was an aberration in his usual approach to problems. Emma finished her bottle and began the fussy movements that Anna immediately recognized as pre-nap signals. She took the baby from William with apologetic efficiency and disappeared into what must be the bedroom. Through the thin walls, William could hear her soft voice singing a Polish lullaby. "She does that every night," Frank said, his tone softening slightly. "Same song her grandmother sang to her. Emma goes right to sleep for it." "How long have you two been trying to have children?" Frank's jaw tightened. "That's not really your business." "You're right, but I'm trying to understand how you could take in a stranger's baby without asking questions. Questions like what? Like whether her real parents might come looking for her someday." Frank sat heavily in an armchair that had seen better decades. "Of course we thought about it, but Anna fell in love with Emma the moment she saw her. And after years of watching her cry every month when the pregnancy tests came back negative, watching her blame herself for our fertility problems, I couldn't say no." The honesty was unexpected, cutting through Frank's defensive posture to reveal the exhausted vulnerability underneath. William recognized the look. He'd seen it in mirrors. After Sarah's death, the face of a man who'd run out of hope and was operating on fumes and stubbornness. "Thomas told you Emma's parents were dead?" "He said there'd been an accident, that she was an orphan who needed immediate care. We figured he was some kind of social worker, maybe working outside official channels to place kids quickly. It happens. Sometimes the system is so backed up, good families wait years while kids age out of the best placement windows." "But you never verified his story." Frank's face flushed. "We tried. Anna called every hospital in the area, asked about infant deaths, car accidents, anything that might confirm what he told us. Nothing matched Emma's timeline or description, but she was so small, so obviously in need of care. We couldn't just turn her over to strangers who might not love her the way we already did." "So you kept her?" "We saved her." The words came out sharp, defensive. "Whatever mistakes we made, whatever laws we might have broken, Emma is alive and healthy and loved. Can you say the same about what would have happened if we'd followed proper procedures?" The question hung between them, unanswerable and uncomfortable. William thought about his own experience with bureaucracies, how money and connections could expedite processes for people who knew how to work the system, but how that same system could grind people like the Kowalskis under its wheels. "I'm not here to judge your decisions." "Then why are you here?" William looked around the small apartment, at the photos showing Frank and Anna's wedding, their extended families, Emma's first months with them. Everything was modest, but chosen with love, arranged with care. This was what a home looked like when it was built on affection rather than aspiration. "I'm here because I need to figure out what's best for Emma. What's best for Emma is leaving her with people who love her. I love her too." Frank studied William with the skeptical assessment of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, fixing things that were broken through patience and skill rather than money and influence. "Do you? Or do you love the idea of her, the way she represents what you lost, what you think you're owed?" The question cut deep because William wasn't certain of the answer. Did he love Emma herself? This growing, changing little person who'd developed her own personality in the months since the accident? Or was he in love with the fantasy of the daughter he'd lost, trying to reclaim a relationship that had been severed before it could fully form? "I don't know," he admitted. Frank's expression softened slightly. "At least you're honest about it." Anna returned from the bedroom, moving with the quiet efficiency of a parent whose child was finally asleep. "She'll be out for a couple hours. Best time of day to have difficult conversations." She sat beside Frank on the couch, and he took her hand with the automatic intimacy of a couple who'd weathered real hardship together. William felt a stab of envy, not for their modest circumstances, but for the obvious partnership they'd built, the way they faced problems as a united front. "What happens now?" Anna asked. "I don't know," William repeated. "I came here thinking I'd demand Emma back, hire lawyers, fight for my parental rights. But seeing her with you, seeing how happy she is—" "You can't just leave her here," Frank said. "Not now that you know where she is. Too many people know the truth. Someone will talk, and then we'll all be in legal trouble. What if we made it official? What if I helped you adopt her legally?" The offer surprised everyone in the room, including William. He hadn't planned to say it, but the words felt right once they were spoken. Anna's eyes widened. "You'd give up your parental rights?" "I'd transfer them to people who've already proven they're good parents." William thought about Thomas's challenge, about what Sarah would have wanted. Emma needs stability, consistency, people who'll put her needs first. "You've already shown you can do that." Frank shook his head. "It's not that simple. Our income, our credit history, our living situation, we'd never qualify for adoption through normal channels. That's why we were still on waiting lists after 3 years of trying. Money can solve those problems. Better apartment, financial security, whatever documentation you need. I can make the adoption process work." In exchange for what? Frank's suspicion had returned. "Rich guys don't give away their kids out of generosity. What do you want from us?" William considered the question seriously. What did he want? To be part of Emma's life somehow? To maintain some connection to the daughter he'd thought was lost? Or simply to know that she was safe, loved, and free from the chaos that seemed to follow him wherever he went? "I want to know she's okay," he said finally. "I want pictures sometimes, updates on how she's doing. And maybe I'd like her to know someday that her biological parents loved her, even if they couldn't be the ones to raise her." Anna was crying again, but quietly this time. "You'd really do that? Give up your own child so she could have a better life?" "Sarah always said that love means wanting what's best for someone, even when it's not what's best for you." William felt tears threatening his own composure. Maybe this is what she meant. Frank stood and walked to the window again, looking out at a neighborhood where children played safely in the streets while their parents watched from stoops and fire escapes. "There's something you need to know before you make any final decisions." "What?" "Thomas didn't just disappear 4 months ago. He's been watching Emma, checking on her, making sure she's okay. He comes by sometimes, brings medicine when she's sick, toys he finds or makes. The man who saved her never really left her." "Where is he?" "Around. He's got a place in an abandoned building a few blocks away, set up like a medical clinic for people who can't afford regular health care. The neighborhood kids call him Dr. Tom. Frank turned back to William. If you really want to do what's best for Emma, you should talk to him first. He knows her better than any of us. He's the one who's been protecting her this whole time. William felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with having a clear next step, but underneath it was something else. Recognition that the story he'd thought he understood was far more complex than he'd imagined. Emma wasn't just a lost daughter to be reclaimed or a symbol of grief to be resolved. She was a real child whose life had been shaped by the love and sacrifice of people who'd put her needs before their own comfort, their own legal safety, their own desperate desire for a family. If he was going to make decisions about her future, he needed to understand the full scope of what that future might hold. And that meant finding Thomas and learning what it really meant to love someone enough to give them up. The abandoned building Frank had described stood like a forgotten monument. To urban decay, 6 stories of broken windows and graffitied brick that the city had written off years ago. But as William approached the entrance, he noticed signs of purposeful activity. A worn path through the debris, discarded medical supplies that had been carefully disposed of, and the lingering scent of antiseptic cutting through the smell of neglect. Thomas's makeshift clinic occupied the ground floor of what had once been a corner grocery store. Someone had cleaned the space meticulously, installed battery-powered lighting, and organized donated medical supplies with the precision of a trained professional. Examination tables constructed from salvaged materials lined one wall, while another held a pharmacy of over-the-counter medications, antibiotics that had likely fallen off delivery trucks, and basic surgical supplies. William found Thomas treating a young boy whose mother held him while he whimpered in Spanish. Thomas worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning a deep cut on the child's arm while speaking in soothing tones that transcended language barriers. "Hold still, Miguel. Almost finished." Thomas applied antiseptic with steady hands, his movements carrying the muscle memory of years of medical training. "There, good as new." The mother tried to press money into Thomas's hand, but he waved it away with a smile. "Just bring me any expired medications from your grandmother's medicine cabinet. That's payment enough." Only after they left did Thomas acknowledge William's presence. "You found the Kowalskis." "I did." "And?" William looked around the clinic, trying to reconcile this organized medical facility with his assumptions about homeless people and their capabilities. "You've been taking care of Emma this whole time. I've been making sure she stays healthy. There's a difference." Thomas cleaned his hands with antibacterial gel, then began reorganizing the supplies he'd used. "Anna and Frank are excellent parents, but they don't have medical training. When Emma had an ear infection last month, when she developed that rash, from the new formula, they needed someone who understood infant health care. So you've been watching her grow up. I've been keeping her safe, the way I should have kept her mother safe." Thomas's voice carried the weight of guilt that had defined the past 4 months. "I was a resident in pediatric emergency medicine when Emma was born, William. I was part of the team that delivered her." The words hit William like a physical blow. "What?" Dr. Thomas Chen, second-year resident, Mount Sinai Hospital. "I was working the night shift when Sarah went into labor. I was the one who handed Emma to you for the first time." William sank onto one of the makeshift examination tables, struggling to process this revelation. "You knew us. You knew who we were." "I knew you were first-time parents who were terrified and excited and completely in love with your daughter. I knew Sarah worried about whether she'd be a good mother, and you worried about whether you'd be a good father. I knew you both cried when Emma took her first breath. Then why," William's voice broke, "why didn't you tell me this at the funeral?" Thomas sat across from him, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. "Because I was the doctor who lost his license 6 weeks after Emma was born. Because I was the promising resident who got destroyed by a malpractice suit and ended up on the streets. Because I knew you'd never trust a homeless drug addict to tell you the truth about your daughter. Drug addict, pain medication initially, for a back injury from medical school, then harder stuff when the pills ran out and the withdrawal was worse than the original pain. Then alcohol when the drugs became too expensive. Thomas spoke with the clinical detachment he might use to describe someone else's symptoms. I lost everything. My apartment, my license, my future, my self-respect. The night of your accident, I was high on whatever I'd managed to buy with money from selling plasma. William stared at him, trying to reconcile this confession with the skilled medical care he'd witnessed, the organized clinic, the careful attention to Emma's well-being. But you saved her. I got lucky. The accident sobered me up fast, nothing like pulling a baby from a burning car to clarify your priorities. My medical training kicked in, and I managed to do what needed to be done. But afterward, when I had to decide what to do with Emma, Thomas shrugged helplessly. I was a homeless addict with no identification, no credibility, no way to convince anyone I was telling the truth. So I made the best decision I could with the options I had. You gave her to the Kowalskis. I gave her to people who could love her while I figured out how to get clean, how to rebuild enough of my life to be worthy of being believed. Thomas gestured around the clinic. This is what I've been working toward. Proof that I'm still a doctor, still capable of helping people, still deserving of trust. William understood now why Thomas had tested him, why he'd demanded proof of character rather than simply revealing Emma's location. Thomas had spent months not just keeping Emma safe, but preparing himself to face the consequences of his decisions. The malpractice suit, what happened? 8-year-old boy, routine appendectomy that went wrong, post-operative infection, sepsis, death within 48 hours. The family needed someone to blame, and I was the resident who'd made the initial assessment. Thomas's voice remained steady, but William could see the pain in his eyes. The attending surgeon had made the critical errors, but he had tenure and reputation and lawyers. I had student loans and no political protection. So you took the fall. I was guilty of being young and inexperienced and trusting a system that was supposed to protect people like me. The suit was eventually dismissed, but the hospital had already let me go. Word gets around in medical circles. No one wants to hire a doctor who's been involved in malpractice litigation, even if they're cleared of wrongdoing. William thought about his own experiences with corporate politics, the way innocent people could be crushed by institutional machinery that prioritized liability management over justice. But Thomas's fall had been more complete than anything. William had witnessed, from promising doctor to homeless drug addict, in a matter of months. How did you get clean? Emma. Thomas smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since William had known him. Having her life in my hands, knowing I was responsible for her well-being, it gave me something to fight for besides my own survival. I checked myself into a clinic, went through detox, started attending meetings. Been clean for 3.5 months now, and you've been rebuilding your medical practice here, informally. I can't practice legally without my license, but I can provide basic health care to people who have nowhere else to go. It's not much, but it's something. William looked around the clinic again, seeing it now as evidence of redemption rather than desperation. Thomas had taken the worst circumstances of his life and found a way to serve others, to use his skills for people who needed them most. What do you want for Emma's future? I want her to grow up, knowing she was loved by everyone who touched her life, her biological parents, her adoptive parents, even the broken doctor who pulled her from a car wreck and spent 4 months learning how to be worthy of that responsibility. And if I want to be part of that future. Thomas studied William with the same clinical assessment he'd probably used to evaluate patients. That depends on whether you've learned what I've learned. That love isn't about ownership or control or getting what you think you deserve. It's about showing up for someone else's needs, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. I'm willing to learn. Good. Because Emma's going to need all the love she can get from all the parents she's acquired along the way. Thomas stood and moved to a file cabinet constructed from milk crates, pulling out a manila folder. There's something else you need to know before you make any final decisions about her future. He handed William the folder, which contained medical records, photographs, and legal documents that had been carefully preserved despite the chaos of the past months. Emma wasn't the only child in that car wreck, William. Your wife was carrying twins. The folder slipped from William's suddenly nerveless fingers, scattering papers across the clinic floor. He stared at Thomas, unable to process what he'd just heard. Twins? Emma has a brother, Samuel. He was smaller, weaker, barely breathing. When I pulled them both from the car, I wasn't sure he'd survive the first night, but he's a fighter, just like his sister. William's world tilted again, the same disorienting sensation he'd felt at the funeral when Thomas first claimed Emma. Was alive. Where is he? With another family, people who specialize in caring for children with medical complications. Samuel had some developmental delays from the trauma, needed more intensive care than the Kowalskis could provide. I have a son. You have 2 children who've been thriving with families that love them. The question now is whether you're ready to be the father both of them deserve, or whether you're going to tear apart the only stability they've ever known for the sake of your own grief. William bent to gather the scattered papers, his hands shaking as he tried to absorb this new reality. Among the documents was a photograph that stopped his breath. 2 infants sleeping side by side, obviously newborns, obviously related. Emma and Samuel, taken sometime in their first weeks with their respective families. Sarah never mentioned twins. The ultrasounds showed one baby until late in the pregnancy. It happens sometimes. One twin hides behind the other. The second. Heartbeat wasn't detected until Sarah was in active labor. Thomas knelt to help gather the papers, his voice gentle with the memory. She was so surprised, so happy. Kept saying she couldn't believe she was getting 2 babies when she'd been afraid she might never have one. She died knowing about Samuel? She held them both before. Thomas stopped, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence. She named him Samuel David, after your brother. Said she wanted him to have family connections, to know where he came from. William felt tears he thought he'd exhausted over the past 4 days. Sarah had died, knowing they had twins, had named their son after David, had held both babies in what must have been her final conscious moments. The image was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Why separate them? Why not keep them together? Because I was a homeless addict making decisions in crisis mode with limited options and no resources. Thomas's honesty was brutal in its simplicity. The Kowalskis could handle 1 healthy infant. Samuel needed specialized care I couldn't provide and they couldn't afford. I had to choose between keeping the twins together with inadequate care or separating them to give both the best chance at survival, and you chose separation. I chose their individual well-being over my preference for tidy solutions. Sometimes, love means making the harder choice. William studied the photograph again, looking for resemblances and differences between his children. Emma was clearly the stronger twin, fuller-faced, more alert. Samuel appeared smaller, more fragile, but there was something in his expression, even as a newborn, that suggested Sarah's stubborn determination. What kind of medical complications? Mild. Cerebral palsy, probably from oxygen deprivation during the accident. Nothing that will prevent him from living a full life, but he'll need physical therapy, occupational therapy, specialists who understand his specific needs. Thomas pulled out another file. The Hendersons have been fostering children with special needs for 10 years. They know how to advocate for kids like Samuel, how to make sure he gets the services he needs to thrive. Foster family. They were hoping to adopt him, but the bureaucracy is complicated when there's no clear legal pathway. Samuel is technically a ward of the state, placed with them on an emergency basis while his case works through the system, which means he could be moved at any time. Which means both of your children are in legal limbo until someone with standing makes decisions about their permanent placement. William felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. For months, he'd been consumed with grief over children he thought were dead. Now he had to navigate the infinitely more complex challenge of being a father to children who were alive, growing, and bonded to other people. "I want to meet Samuel." "I thought you might." Thomas handed him another address, this one in Brooklyn. "The Hendersons are good people, but they're also protective. Samuel has been through trauma, the accident, separation from his twin, the stress of his medical needs. They won't let you disrupt his routine unless they're convinced it's in his best interest. What do I need to do to convince them? The same thing you needed to do to convince me. Prove that you understand what he needs is more important than what you want." That evening, William called David from the penthouse, pacing the length of his living room while he tried to explain the day's revelations. His brother listened in silence until William finished, then exhaled slowly. "Twins. Twins. This changes everything, Will. We're not talking about a simple custody issue anymore. We're talking about two children who've been placed illegally with families who have no legal standing to keep them. The state is going to want answers about how this happened, why proper procedures weren't followed, who's responsible for the unauthorized placements. The children are healthy and loved. Isn't that what matters? In a perfect world, yes. In the real world, bureaucracies don't forgive irregular procedures, even when they produce good outcomes." David's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd spent decades navigating legal systems that prioritized process over results. "You need to be prepared for the possibility that neither family will be allowed to keep the children once this becomes official." Then what happens to Emma and Samuel? They go into the system while courts sort out the custody issues. Could take months, maybe years. The thought of his children in institutional care while lawyers argued about proper procedures made William's stomach turn. Emma and Samuel had already lost their mother, been separated from each other, and formed attachments to families who'd stepped in when official systems failed them. Now, the very act of claiming them might subject them to more trauma. There has to be another way. Maybe, if we can present the court with a plan that serves the children's best interests while addressing the legal irregularities. But that would require cooperation from all parties, the foster families, Thomas, social services, and you. What kind of cooperation? The kind that puts the children's needs before anyone's pride or legal standing. The kind that focuses on stability and continuity rather than punishment for past mistakes. David paused, and William could hear papers rustling as his brother made notes. "It's complicated, Will, and it's going to require you to make some decisions about what kind of father you want to be." After ending the call, William walked to Emma's nursery, the room that had been prepared for one child, and now somehow felt inadequate for the scope of what he'd learned. Sarah's presence lingered in every detail. The mobile she'd chosen with its dancing elephants, the books she'd selected for bedtime stories, the rocking chair positioned to catch morning light. He pulled out his phone and found the voice memo. He'd recorded of Sarah humming her lullaby, but now, listening to it, he could hear something he'd missed before, the way her voice occasionally harmonized with itself, as if she was singing to more than one listener. Had she known, even unconsciously, that she was carrying twins? Had some maternal instinct told her there were two heartbeats instead of one, two souls growing inside her, two children who would need different kinds of love and care? William played the recording again, imagining Sarah in the hospital room, with both babies, naming Samuel after David, while Emma slept in the crook of her other arm. The image was beautiful and heartbreaking, a perfect family moment that had lasted only minutes before being shattered by loss and circumstance. But perhaps it didn't have to stay shattered. Perhaps love really could find a way to rebuild what Trauma had broken, even if the new shape looked nothing like what anyone had originally planned. Perhaps being a father meant learning to hold space for possibilities that were messier and more complicated than fairy tale endings, but ultimately more real than anything money or power could purchase. William closed his eyes and made a decision that would have terrified the man he'd been 6 months ago, but felt inevitable to the man he was becoming. He would meet Samuel tomorrow. He would talk to the Hendersons. He would sit down with Thomas and the Kowalskis and his brother and anyone else whose opinion mattered, and together they would figure out how to build a family that honored both the love that had created these children and the love that had saved them, even if that family looked nothing like what any of them had originally imagined, even if it required more courage, more compromise, and more faith than William had ever thought himself capable of, because Emma and Samuel deserved nothing less than the best of all the people who loved them, arranged in whatever configuration would serve their needs rather than the adults' desires for neat traditional solutions. Sarah had always said that love was about becoming your best self for someone else's sake. William was finally beginning to understand what she meant. The Henderson home in Park Slope was everything the Kowalski apartment wasn't: spacious, professionally decorated, equipped with the specialized furniture and medical equipment that Samuel's care required. Accessibility ramps, grab bars, and wide doorways spoke to years of experience accommodating children with varying physical needs. Diane Henderson answered the door with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to unexpected visitors. She was in her early 50s, grey-haired and sturdy, wearing scrubs that suggested she'd either just finished or was about to begin a medical shift. "Mr. Harrow, Thomas said you might be coming by. Thank you for seeing me. Come in. Samuel's just finishing his physical therapy session." The living room had been converted into a combination playroom and medical facility. Colorful toys shared space with therapeutic equipment, while family photos showed years of children who'd passed through the Henderson home. Some briefly, others for extended stays, all obviously loved during their time there. Samuel sat in a specialized chair designed to support his posture while he worked with a physical therapist on exercises that looked like play but were clearly purposeful. At 4 months, he was noticeably smaller than Emma, but his eyes held the same alert. Intelligence William recognized from Sarah. "Samuel, we have a visitor," Diane said softly. The baby turned toward William's voice with curiosity rather than fear. His movements were slightly slower than Emma's had been, less coordinated, but determined. When William approached, Samuel reached out with one small hand, fingers grasping at air with the universal infant desire to touch and explore. "He's beautiful. He's a fighter." The physical therapist, a young woman named Kelly, guided Samuel through range of motion exercises. While she spoke, "His muscle tone is improving every week. The early intervention is making a huge difference." William watched his son work through movements that would be effortless for typical children, but required concentration and effort for Samuel. There was something inspiring about the baby's persistence, the way he kept trying even when his body didn't cooperate with his intentions. "Can I hold him?" Diane and Kelly exchanged glances, the silent communication of professionals who'd learned to read subtle cues in children's responses to new situations. "Samuel's very sensitive to changes in routine and environment," Diane explained. "New people can sometimes overwhelm him, trigger regression in his progress." "I understand. But," Kelly added with a smile, "he's also incredibly social. Loves meeting new people once he feels safe with them." They guided William through the proper way to support Samuel's head and neck, how to position him to avoid putting stress on muscles that were still developing strength and coordination. When Samuel settled into William's arms, the baby studied, his face with intense concentration, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "He's figuring you out," Diane observed. "Samuel's very good at reading people's emotions." Comes from having to depend on others for everything. He's learned to interpret facial expressions and voice tones like a little scientist. William found himself smiling despite the weight of everything he'd learned over the past week. Samuel responded to the smile with one of his own, slower to form than Emma's quick grins, but radiant once it appeared. "He looks like Sarah. Thomas showed us pictures of your wife. We've been telling Samuel stories about his birth parents, making sure he knows he was wanted and loved even though they couldn't be the ones to raise him." The thoughtfulness of that gesture. Strangers ensuring his son knew his origins, preserving Sarah's memory for a child who would never remember. Her directly brought tears to William's eyes. What kind of stories? Happy ones, about how excited his parents were when they found out he was coming, how his mother sang to him before he was born, how his father promised to love him enough for 10 dads. Diane's voice carried the warmth of someone who understood the importance of narrative in a child's development. We want him to grow up knowing he was celebrated, not just survived. Over the next hour, William learned about Samuel's daily routine: physical therapy sessions, medical appointments, feeding schedules adapted to his specific needs. The Hendersons had structured their entire household around creating the most supportive environment possible for children with special needs. "We've fostered 43 children over the past 12 years, Diane explained, as they watched Samuel work with adaptive toys designed to strengthen his motor skills. Some stayed for weeks, others for years. A few we were able to adopt when their biological families couldn't provide appropriate care. And Samuel we love like our own, but we've always known he had family somewhere, that someday someone might come looking for him." She looked at William with the direct honesty he was learning to expect from people who'd built their lives around caring for others. "The question is, what do you want for him?" "I want what's best for him." That's what every parent says. But what does it mean specifically for a child with Samuel's needs? William watched his son manipulate a puzzle designed to improve hand-eye coordination, noting the intense concentration required for movements that would be automatic for typical children. Samuel's determination was obvious, but so was his need for specialized support. "I don't know enough about special needs parenting to answer that question." "But you're willing to learn." "I'm willing to do whatever Samuel needs," Diane nodded approvingly. "That's the right answer. Not "I'll figure it out" or "money can solve problems." Just willingness to put his needs first. Frank Henderson arrived, home from his job as a special education teacher, just as William was preparing to leave. He was younger than his wife, probably mid-40s, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years working with children who learn differently. "So you're the biological father," Frank said without preamble. "Thomas said you might be coming around. I wanted to meet Samuel, understand his situation. His situation is stable, loving, and medically appropriate. Question is, are you planning to change that?" The directness was challenging but not hostile. Frank Henderson was protecting Samuel the same way Anna Kowalski protected Emma, with the fierce devotion of someone who'd chosen to love a child regardless of biological connections. "I'm trying to figure out what's right. What's right is whatever serves Samuel's development and emotional well-being. He's made incredible progress with us because his environment is predictable, his care is consistent, and his needs are understood." Frank sat beside William, lowering his voice so Samuel wouldn't overhear, taking him from the only family he's known and placing him with someone who's never dealt with special needs children. That could undo months of progress. "But he's my son. Biologically, yes. Practically, he's ours. We're the ones who've been up with him during seizures, who've learned his communication signals, who've advocated for his services and fought insurance companies for his therapies." Frank's voice carried no anger, just tired certainty. "Love isn't just about wanting someone. It's about being competent to care for them." The word competent hit William hard. He'd never questioned his ability to provide for Emma and Samuel. Money Goodbye the best medical care, the finest schools, every advantage wealth could offer. But competence was different from resources. Competence meant understanding day-to-day needs, recognizing subtle changes in behavior, knowing when to seek help and when to trust your instincts. What would it take for me to become competent? Frank's expression softened slightly. Time, training, humility, the willingness to put Samuel's needs before your own grief or guilt or desire to be a traditional father. I have time. Do you? Because the state is going to want this situation resolved quickly once they find out about it. And they will find out. Too many people know the truth now for it to stay secret much longer. William understood the implicit timeline. Whatever decisions were going to be made about Emma and Samuel's futures needed to happen soon, before bureaucratic machinery took over and removed choice from everyone involved. What if we could make it official? The adoptions, I mean. What if I could help both families adopt legally while maintaining some kind of relationship with the children? You'd give up your parental rights? I'd transfer them to people who've already proven they're good parents. William looked at Samuel, who'd fallen asleep in his specialized chair with the contentment of a child who felt completely secure. But I'd want to be part of their lives somehow, not as a father maybe, but as someone who cares about their well-being. Frank exchanged glances with his wife, another of those silent marital communications that William envied. You'd need to talk to both families, make sure everyone's comfortable with that arrangement. And you'd need to talk to Thomas. He's the one who's been coordinating everything, making sure both children stay healthy and safe. Is that possible? An arrangement that satisfies everyone? Possible, maybe. Easy. Definitely not, Diane rejoined. The conversation, settling into the chair closest to Samuel's so she could monitor his sleep. You're talking about a very unconventional family structure. Multiple parents, ongoing relationships across traditional boundaries, legal arrangements that don't fit standard categories. Sarah always said that family was about love, not law. Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. William felt the familiar ache of missing Sarah, but it was accompanied now by something else. Gratitude for the lessons she'd tried to teach him, appreciation for the foundation she'd laid for him to build on. There's something else you should consider, Frank said quietly. Samuel and Emma are twins. They have a bond that existed before birth, a connection that separation hasn't broken. If you're serious about doing what's best for them, you need to think about what it means to keep them apart indefinitely. You're saying they should be together. I'm saying that's a decision that should be made based on their needs, not our convenience. Twins have unique relationships, especially twins who survive trauma together. Keeping them separated might be the practical solution, but it might not be the right one. William looked at Samuel, peaceful in his therapeutic chair, and thought about Emma, probably being fed her evening bottle in Queens while Anna sang Polish lullabies. Two children who shared genetics and history and trauma, growing up in different worlds, unaware of each other's existence. How would we make that work? Emma's with a family that can provide basic care. Samuel's with specialists who understand his medical needs. That's the question, isn't it? Diane smiled with the gentle challenge of someone who'd spent years helping people solve impossible problems. But the answer might be simpler than you think. Sometimes families grow in directions nobody planned, and somehow everyone ends up exactly where they need to be. As William prepared to leave, Samuel woke from his nap and immediately began the fussy movements that preceded feeding time. Diane moved to prepare his bottle with the same practiced efficiency Anna had shown with Emma. Would you like to feed him before you go? William accepted Samuel with less fear than he'd felt holding Emma. His son's smaller size somehow made him feel more protective rather than more nervous. Samuel settled into the feeding routine with trust that made William's heart ache. He knows you, Frank observed. Babies are good at recognizing family, even when they don't understand the relationship. Sitting in that specialized home, feeding his son while dedicated caregivers watched with approval, William understood that the next decisions he made would determine not just Emma and Samuel's immediate future, but the entire trajectory of their lives. Would they grow up as siblings, aware of their shared history? Would they know they had a biological father who loved them enough to ensure they got the best possible care, even if he couldn't provide it himself? Or would legal complications and adult pride tear apart the delicate network of care that Thomas had built around two vulnerable children? The answers would come soon. But for now, William was content to feed his son and learn what it felt like to be part of a family that worked, not because it followed traditional patterns, but because everyone involved had chosen to put the children's needs first, even when that choice required sacrificing everything they'd thought they wanted for themselves. The family court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after the accident that had started everything. William sat at the plaintiff's table beside his legal team, watching as the various parties took their assigned places in the sterile courtroom that would determine his children's future. Judge Patricia Morales presided with the patient authority of someone who'd spent 20 years making decisions about children's lives. She was known for thoroughness, for asking difficult questions, and for prioritizing children's well-being over adults' preferences. David had warned William that she wouldn't be impressed by wealth or influence, only by evidence that proposed arrangements served the minors' best interests. The Kowalskis sat with their court-appointed attorney, Anna, holding Emma with obvious reluctance to let her go. Emma, now 8 months old, was alert and curious, looking around the courtroom with the fearless interest of a baby who'd never learned to distrust new situations. The Hendersons occupied the row behind them with Samuel, who required his specialized chair and medical equipment, even for short trips outside their home. He was smaller than Emma, but clearly thriving, his eyes bright with intelligence despite the physical challenges that would shape his development. Thomas sat alone in the back row, wearing a donated suit that was too large, but clean and pressed. He'd testified earlier in chambers about the circumstances of the rescue, his subsequent decisions, and his ongoing relationship with both families. His medical expertise had been verified, his current sobriety confirmed, his motives examined by social workers who'd ultimately concluded he'd acted in the children's best interests despite the irregular procedures. This is an unusual case. Judge Morales began reviewing the files that documented the past 6 months of investigation and evaluation. We have 2 infant siblings who survived a tragic accident, were rescued by a bystander with medical training, and were placed informally with families who've provided excellent care despite having no legal authority to do so. She looked around the courtroom, her gaze settling on each party in turn. The state's interest is in ensuring these children's safety and well-being while resolving the legal irregularities that brought us here. Mr. Harrow, as the biological father, you have a presumptive right to custody. However, that right must be balanced against the children's best interests and their current placement stability. William's attorney, a specialist in family law whom David had recommended, rose to present their case. Your Honor, Mr. Harrow is a devoted father who believed his children had died in the same accident that killed his wife. Upon learning they survived, he sought not to disrupt their care, but to ensure their continued well-being while establishing appropriate legal relationships. What is Mr. Harrow seeking specifically? Joint custody arrangements that recognize both the biological relationship and the established caretaking relationships. Mr. Harrow proposes to provide financial support for both families while maintaining meaningful contact with Emma and Samuel. Judge Morales made notes, then turned to the Kowalski's attorney. Mrs. Kowalski, you've been caring for Emma for 6 months without legal authorization. How do you justify this arrangement? Anna stood, her voice shaking but determined. Your Honor, we were told Emma was an orphan who needed immediate care. We acted out of compassion, not out of any desire to circumvent legal procedures. When we realized the situation was more complicated than we'd been told, our priority became Emma's stability and well-being. And now that the biological father has been located, we want what's best for Emma. If that means maintaining our relationship, while acknowledging Mr. Harrow's rights, we're willing to explore that arrangement. If it means giving her up entirely, Anna's voice broke slightly. We'll do whatever serves her needs. The judge's expression softened at Anna's obvious struggle to put Emma's interests before her own heartbreak. Mr. Henderson, your situation with Samuel is somewhat different given his special needs. What is your assessment of his current placement requirements? Frank Henderson stood with the quiet confidence of someone who testified in similar proceedings before. Your Honor, Samuel requires consistent, specialized care from people who understand his specific needs. He's made remarkable progress in our home because his environment is stable and his caregivers are trained in pediatric special needs. Any disruption to his routine could result in regression that might take months to overcome. Are you seeking to adopt Samuel? We've been hoping to, yes, but we understand that decision now rests with his biological father. Judge Morales turned to William, her expression unreadable. Mr. Harrow, you've had several months to evaluate your children's current placements. What are you asking this court to order? William stood, feeling the weight of every conversation he'd had over the past months, with Thomas about the nature of love, with Anna and Frank about practical parenting, with the Hendersons about special needs care, with Linda at the soup kitchen about how loss could transform understanding. Your Honor, I'm asking the court to approve a custody arrangement that prioritizes Emma and Samuel's continuity of care while establishing my legal standing as their father. Can you be more specific? I propose that the Kowalskis be granted legal guardianship of Emma with my full support and financial backing, while the Hendersons receive the same arrangement for Samuel. I would maintain visitation rights and involvement in major decisions, but the day-to-day parenting would remain with the families who've already proven their competence and love. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Morales raised an eyebrow. You're essentially asking to give up custody while maintaining parental rights? I'm asking to formalize arrangements that are already working in the children's best interests. This is highly irregular, Mr. Harrow. Most biological parents in your situation would seek full custody, particularly given your financial resources. William thought about Sarah, about the lessons she'd tried to teach him about love being selfless rather than possessive. My financial resources don't make me a better parent than people who've already demonstrated their commitment to my children's well-being. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Morales made extensive notes, then looked up with the serious expression that preceded difficult questions. Mr. Harrow, I need to understand your motivations here. Are you proposing this arrangement because you genuinely believe it serves the children's interests, or because you're unprepared for the responsibilities of single parenthood? The question was fair and brutal. William felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, the families who'd cared for his children, the social workers who'd evaluated all parties, the legal teams who'd crafted arguments for various outcomes. Both, Your Honor. I believe Emma and Samuel are thriving with their current families, and I'm honest enough to admit that I'm not prepared to provide the level of specialized care they're receiving. But more than that, he paused, trying to find words for feelings he was still learning to understand. I've learned that being a father means wanting your children to have the best possible lives, even when that's not the same as having them live with you. Judge Morales leaned forward, her voice carrying the gravity of someone about to reshape multiple lives with her next words. Mr. Harrow, what you're proposing is unprecedented in my courtroom. You're asking me to approve an arrangement that essentially creates extended family relationships with legal standing. Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that this would mean giving up traditional custody rights? You couldn't simply change your mind later if you decided you wanted the children to live with you full-time? William felt the finality of the moment settling around him like weight. I understand. Mrs. Kowalski, Mr. Henderson, are you both willing to accept legal guardianship under these terms? Understanding that Mr. Harrow would maintain parental rights and involvement in major decisions, Anna stood, Emma secure in her arms. Your Honor, we love Emma as if she were our biological daughter. If Mr. Harrow is willing to formalize an arrangement that keeps her with us while acknowledging his role in her life, we're grateful for that opportunity. Frank Henderson nodded his agreement. Samuel has thrived in our care, and we believe continuity is crucial for his continued development. We're prepared to accept guardianship with Mr. Harrow's involvement. And what about the unusual circumstances that brought us here? Mr. Chen, you're not a party to these proceedings, but your actions created this situation. The court needs to address the irregular nature of the children's placements. Thomas stood, his voice steady, despite the weight of months of uncertainty. Your Honor, I made decisions in a crisis situation based on my medical training and my assessment of what the children needed. I don't regret saving their lives, but I acknowledge that my subsequent choices were legally problematic. The state has elected not to pursue criminal charges against you, given the humanitarian nature of your actions and the positive outcomes for the children. However, this court cannot endorse vigilante rescues, regardless of their good intentions. I understand. Your Honor, Judge Morales made more notes, then addressed the courtroom as a whole. Before I make my ruling, I want to hear from the children's advocate. Mrs. Rodriguez, what is your assessment of the proposed arrangements? Maria Rodriguez, a social worker who'd spent weeks evaluating all parties, stood with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to speaking for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. Your Honor, both children are thriving in their current placements. Emma has reached all developmental milestones and shows strong attachment to the Kowalski family. Samuel has made remarkable progress in his therapies and demonstrates secure bonding with the Hendersons. And your recommendation? The proposed arrangement serves both children's immediate and long-term interests. Emma and Samuel would maintain stability with proven caregivers while preserving their biological family connections and ensuring financial security for their futures. What about the separation of the twins? Is it in their interest to be raised apart? Ms. Rodriguez glanced at both families before answering. While twin relationships are significant, these children have been apart for most of their lives and have formed primary attachments to their respective families. Forcing reunification now could be more disruptive than beneficial, especially given Samuel's special needs. Judge Morales closed her files and looked around the courtroom one final time. This case presents competing interests that don't fit neatly into legal precedents. We have a biological father with legitimate rights, foster families who've provided excellent care without authorization, and children whose welfare must take precedence over all other considerations. William felt his heart hammering as the judge prepared to render her decision. Everything he'd learned about love and sacrifice and the true meaning of family had led to this moment. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, this court finds that the children's best interests are served by maintaining their current living arrangements while formalizing the legal relationships. Relief flooded the courtroom. Anna hugged Emma closer while tears streamed down her face. The Hendersons exchanged quiet smiles of satisfaction and exhaustion. However, the judge continued, this arrangement comes with specific conditions. Mr. Harrow, you will maintain parental rights but transfer physical custody to the respective families. You will provide financial support as outlined in the agreement, but the families will retain primary decision-making authority for day-to-day care. I accept those terms, Your Honor. Mrs. Kowalski, Mr. Henderson, you will submit to regular home studies and maintain open communication with Mr. Harrow regarding the children's welfare. Any significant changes in circumstances must be reported to the court. Both families nodded their agreement. Finally, Mr. Chen, while this court cannot officially sanction your methods. It recognizes that your actions saved these children's lives. However, any future situations of this nature must be handled through proper channels. Thomas bowed his head. Understood, Your Honor. The court will draft formal custody and guardianship orders reflecting these arrangements. Congratulations to all parties for putting the children's welfare first in what could have been a much more adversarial proceeding. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in quiet celebration and relief. William felt hands on his shoulders, David offering wordless support, Margaret dabbing at her eyes with professional tissues, the various attorneys congratulating each other on an outcome that served everyone's interests. But William's attention was fixed on his children. Emma, alert and babbling in Anna's arms, reaching toward the colorful mobile someone had brought to keep her entertained during the proceedings. Samuel, peaceful in his specialized chair, surrounded by the medical equipment that ensured his comfort and safety. They were his children, but they weren't his to raise. They would grow up knowing he loved them, but calling other people Mom and Dad. They would have his financial support, but other people's daily devotion. It was the hardest decision he'd ever made, and somehow the most clearly right. As families began gathering their belongings and preparing to leave, Thomas approached William with the manila folder that had started everything. "There's one more thing," he said quietly, handing over documents William hadn't seen before. "Something I've been working on since the night I saved them." William opened the folder to find architectural plans, financial projections, and legal documents outlining something called the Sarah Harrow Foundation for Pediatric Emergency Care. "What is this?" "A way to make sure what happened to Emma and Samuel, what happened to all of us, doesn't happen to other families." Thomas's voice carried quiet determination. "A foundation that provides immediate specialized care for children in crisis situations, with medical professionals who understand trauma recovery and family preservation." William studied the plans, recognizing the scope and ambition of what Thomas had conceived. "You want to institutionalize what you did for Emma and Samuel. I want to make sure other children don't fall through the cracks the way they almost did. And I want to do it legally, with proper oversight and professional standards. You want me to fund it. I want you to help me build something that honors Sarah's memory while protecting other families from what we all went through." William felt something shift in his chest, not the desperate urgency that had driven him for months, but a quieter sense of purpose that felt sustainable and meaningful. Sarah would have loved this idea. "That's why I want to do it right. With proper medical facilities, licensed professionals, and protocols that ensure children's safety while preserving family connections whenever possible." As they spoke, Emma began fussing in Anna's arms, her schedule disrupted by the morning's unusual routine. Without thinking, Anna handed her to William while she searched for a pacifier in the diaper bag. Emma settled against William's shoulder. With the trust of a child who'd learned that adults in her world were safe and reliable. She smelled like baby powder and the gentle detergent Anna used for her clothes. But underneath those scents, William caught something that reminded him of Sarah, some indefinable essence that couldn't be replicated or replaced. "She's going to be okay," he murmured, as much to himself as to Emma. "They both are," Thomas agreed, "because they're surrounded by people who love them enough to make difficult choices." The formal custody transfer would take place the following week, with both families officially recognized as legal guardians, while William maintained his parental rights and responsibilities. The arrangement was complex enough that it would require ongoing legal oversight. But Judge Morales had been clear that the court's primary concern was the children's welfare rather than administrative convenience. As the courthouse emptied, William found himself walking beside Anna and Frank toward the parking garage, Emma content in her stroller while they navigated the maze of downtown traffic. "What happens now?" Anna asked. "I mean, practically speaking, how do we make this work? Day to day, we figure it out as we go," William said. The same way you've been figuring out parenthood for the past 6 months. Frank smiled, the first completely relaxed expression William had seen from him. Fair enough, but you should know, we're going to need some ground rules. About visits, about decisions, about what to call each other in front of Emma when she's old enough to understand relationships, what feels right to you. Honestly, I don't know. We're in uncharted territory here. Frank stopped walking, turning to face William directly. But I know this. Emma's lucky to have so many people who love her. Not every kid gets that kind of abundance. William thought about his own childhood, about the scarcity of affection that had shaped his early understanding of love as something to be earned rather than freely given. Emma and Samuel would grow up in a different world, one where love was abundant rather than conditional, where family meant the network of people who chose to show up rather than just those who shared DNA. 1 year later, William stood in the lobby of the Sarah Harrow Foundation for Pediatric Emergency Care, watching children play in a space designed to feel more like a home than a medical facility. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and toys scattered across carpeted areas created an environment where traumatized families could begin healing rather than simply receiving treatment. Thomas emerged from one of the examination rooms wearing scrubs and the confident posture of a man who'd reclaimed his professional identity. His medical license had been restored 6 months earlier after a review board determined that his street clinic work demonstrated continued competence and commitment to patient care. "How's the Morrison family?" William asked, referring to the parents whose 2-year-old had been brought in after a near-drowning incident. "Shaken but recovering. The little girl is going to be fine, no lasting neurological damage, but the parents are struggling with guilt and fear. We'll keep them here for a few days, make sure everyone's stable before they go home." The Foundation's model was unique in pediatric care. Families stayed together during treatment. Parents received counseling alongside their children's medical care, and discharge planning included long-term support networks to prevent future crises. It was everything Thomas had envisioned during those months when he'd been figuring out how to care for Emma and Samuel without proper resources. "Emma's here for her appointment," Margaret announced, appearing with the same efficiency she'd brought to 15 years of managing William's schedule. At 62, she'd officially retired from corporate work, but had become the Foundation's volunteer coordinator, claiming she was too invested in the children's stories to step away completely. Anna arrived with Emma, who at 1-year-old was walking with the determined wobble of a toddler, convinced the world existed for her exploration. She spotted William immediately and toddled toward him with arms outstretched, babbling in the complex language only she understood. "Daddy Will!" she announced, the name they'd settled on to distinguish William from Frank, whom she called simply Daddy. William scooped her up, marveling as he did every week at how much she'd grown and changed. Emma was fearless and social, treating every adult in her extended family network as a potential playmate and source of attention. "How's our girl?" he asked Anna, who was documenting Emma's development with the same attention to detail she brought. To all her parenting responsibilities, wonderful. She's saying more words, sleeping through the night consistently, and has discovered she can climb onto chairs. Frank had to baby-proof our entire apartment last weekend. Any concerns? Just the usual toddler challenges. She's testing boundaries, figuring out how much trouble she can get into before we redirect her. Anna smiled with the tired satisfaction of a parent who'd moved past survival mode into actual enjoyment of the chaos children brought. "Oh, and she's been asking about Samuel more often. I think she's ready for longer visits." The Foundation's family room had been designed with sibling visits in mind. Samuel arrived with Diane Henderson just as Emma finished her routine checkup with Thomas, who'd insisted on continuing as both children's primary physician despite his new administrative responsibilities. Samuel, now walking with the assistance of adaptive equipment, moved more slowly than his twin, but with equal determination. His cerebral palsy affected his fine motor control and balance, but his cognitive development was remarkable. He was already showing signs of the analytical intelligence William recognized from Sarah. "Emma!" Samuel's pronunciation was clearer than it had been even a month earlier, the result of speech therapy and the motivation that came from having someone special to communicate with. The twins' reunion was always magical to witness. They didn't remember being together as newborns, but some deeper recognition sparked between them every time they met. Emma immediately adjusted her play to accommodate Samuel's physical limitations, while Samuel showed patience with Emma's more impulsive tendencies. "They're good for each other," Diane observed, watching Emma help Samuel stack blocks in a game they'd invented that accommodated his coordination challenges while satisfying her need for constant activity. "They balance each other out." Anna agreed. Emma's fearlessness gives Samuel confidence to try new things, and his thoughtfulness helps her slow down and focus. William settled into one of the comfortable chairs designed for parents to observe their children's interactions, feeling the deep contentment that had replaced his earlier desperation. This wasn't the family life he'd planned with Sarah, but it was rich and complex and full of love in ways they never could have anticipated. "The monthly reports came in from both households," Margaret said, handing William a folder. "Emma's developmental assessments, Samuel's therapy progress, both families' financial statements, photos from the past month." William reviewed the documents. That had become part of his routine, evidence that his children were thriving under the care of people who'd chosen to love them completely. The Kowalskis had moved to a larger apartment with financial assistance from the foundation, allowing Emma her own bedroom and play space. The Hendersons had upgraded Samuel's medical equipment and added a full-time aide who specialized in pediatric physical therapy. Both families sent pictures weekly. Emma's first steps, Samuel's first clear sentences, birthday celebrations, and ordinary moments that documented the texture of their daily lives. William kept copies of everything in albums he'd started maintaining, creating records his children could review someday when they were old enough to understand their unusual origin story. "Dr. Chen wants to discuss the expansion proposal," Margaret continued. "The city's interested in replicating the foundation model in other boroughs. What does Thomas recommend? Slow growth, careful screening of partners, maintaining quality over quantity. He's learned from his own mistakes about moving too quickly without proper support systems." William nodded, trusting Thomas's judgment completely. The foundation had become more than either of them had originally envisioned, a model for trauma-informed family care that was being studied by pediatric facilities across the country. As the afternoon progressed, both families gathered in the foundation's family room for Emma's first birthday celebration. The cake was modest, Anna's homemade creation decorated with Emma's favorite colors, but the gathering felt profound in its ordinariness. Emma, delighted to be the center of attention, smeared frosting across her face while Samuel watched with the intense focus he brought to everything. Frank and Anna sang "Happy Birthday," while Diane and Frank Henderson provided harmony. Thomas documented everything with the digital camera he'd learned to use for medical records, and Margaret organized the gifts with her usual efficiency. William sat slightly apart, observing the family they'd all somehow become. It wasn't traditional, wasn't what any of them had planned, but it worked. Emma and Samuel were loved completely by multiple adults who coordinated their care like members of an extended family rather than strangers bound by legal documents. As the celebration wound down, William found himself alone with Thomas while the others cleaned up. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked. William considered the question seriously. Did he regret giving up traditional custody? Did he wish he'd fought for his rights as a biological parent? Did he sometimes wonder what it would have been like to raise Emma and Samuel himself? "None," he said finally. "This is what Sarah would have wanted. This is what love looks like when it's not about possession. She'd be proud of you. She'd be proud of all of us." William watched Emma toddle between her various parent figures, collecting hugs and attention with the confidence of a child who'd never doubted she was cherished. "We figured out how to build something beautiful from something broken." Thomas smiled, the genuine expression of a man who'd found his way back to purpose and meaning after losing everything that had once defined him. Sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other. As the evening ended and families prepared to return to their respective homes, William felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing his children would sleep safely in beds surrounded by love. Emma would dream in her pink bedroom in Queens, while Anna sang Polish lullabies. Samuel would rest in his specialized bed in Brooklyn, while Frank and Diane monitored his breathing and adjusted his position for optimal comfort. And William would go home to his penthouse, no longer empty, but filled with purpose. He had children who knew they were loved, a foundation that honored Sarah's memory by serving other families in crisis, and a network of relationships that had taught him family could be chosen as well as inherited. The pain of losing Sarah would never completely disappear, but it had transformed into something manageable, grief that honored her memory rather than paralyzed him with regret. Emma and Samuel would grow up knowing their mother had loved them enough to bring them into the world, and their extended family loved them enough to put their needs first. Standing in the foundation lobby, surrounded by evidence of what love could build when it focused on service rather than possession, William understood that Sarah's greatest gift hadn't been Emma and Samuel themselves, but the lessons that had made it possible for him to love them well. He pulled out his phone and played her lullaby one more time, but now, instead of aching with loss, he felt grateful for the wisdom she'd tried to share. Love wasn't about holding on tightly to what you wanted to keep. Love was about creating space for people to become their best selves, even when that meant letting them grow beyond your ability to contain them. Emma and Samuel would always be his children, but they would never be his alone. They belonged to everyone who'd chosen to love them, and that abundance would give them strength for whatever challenges life might bring. It wasn't the ending William had imagined when he'd first learned they were alive, but it was better than anything he could have planned. Because the best love stories weren't about getting what you wanted. They were about discovering what you never knew you needed and having the courage to build it from whatever materials love and circumstance provided. In the end, that was Sarah's final gift to all of them. The understanding that family was not a structure to be preserved, but a living thing to be nurtured, grown, and shared with anyone willing to tend it with care.